I'm glad to be here with John Tweeddale. John, academic dean at Reformation Bible College, but before that, you served as a pastor. How many years were you a pastor?
I was pastoring in Pittsburgh at the First Reformed Presbyterian Church, a historic PCA congregation on the east side of Pittsburgh. I was there for a little over 5 years, and they were incredibly happy years for me.
So you went straight from seminary to that call in Pittsburgh?
Nope. I went to seminary at RTS in Jackson. I was a lowly intern at First Presbyterian Church in Jackson. Met my wife at RTS. She came down from Minnesota. And then we left RTS and went to Scotland and spent 3 incomparable years in city centre Edinburgh. And I did PhD work at the university there at New College, and then from time to time would go next door to the Free Church College, now Edinburgh Seminary, and enjoyed good friendships there. And then so I went from Edinburgh then to Pittsburgh, and while I was in Pittsburgh, got to pastor full-time, and then also teach some at the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and loved it. In many ways, I thought I was going to be there for the rest of my life, and still very much see my primary kind of vocation and calling is as a minister of the gospel.
Where did you worship in Edinburgh?
At Buccleuch and Greyfriars Free Church, which is near Old College, and we lived in a flat owned by one of the elders in that congregation, and we were basically a block or so from Buccleuch, and it was a home away from home for us, and we absolutely loved being there.
All right, so you're a pastor in Pittsburgh, also doing some teaching.
Yep.
And then what was it? You're very invested in pastoral ministry, still very committed to pastoral ministry. But at some point along the way, in God's providence, you made the decision to take a call in more academic preparation. Not all your students become pastors, but a certain percentage do.
Sure.
So what was that thought process like? Because you're still, I know, very committed to the church.
Right. Yeah. So my dad used to say, John, certainly in your early years especially, you need to dig deep wells from which you'll be able to draw cups of cold water to give God's people, and you need to dig as deep as you possibly can. So I had always thought as a young man I wanted to get as much training as I could, as much experience as I could, and had good models. When I was in college, Jim Boyce died, and I know you knew Dr. Boyce, and that was a model of an educated pastor and somebody who got the best training but then used it for the purpose of the pulpit and the church. And that left a huge impression on me, and then going through seminary, having kind of pastors and mentors like Derek Thomas and Lig Duncan, who kind of modeled that for me as well. So I thought that's what I would continue to do. I wanted to get as much training, I wanted to get as much experience, but I wanted to use all of that for the purpose of shepherding and pastoring. And then a number of events came up and that led to some personal loss in my family. And I had an opportunity to go be a part of Ligonier Ministries during that time. It was an happy and unexpected providence. And to begin with, I said no. And yet it was the right time and right place. I don't think I could have gone from one congregation to another congregation, but going from a congregation to a parachurch and a college was a great opportunity for me, where I could continue to shepherd people, but do so on the academic side. And so I think of myself as an academic shepherd now.
When you were, it sounds like during your time of pastoral preparation, one of the things you were really focused on, you said digging deep wells. And so the academic aspect of that is one of the things we think about the most. But as you think back, or even as you think now about what you're doing, what are ways that students or men who are considering a possible call to pastoral ministry need to be digging deep wells, not just academically, which you did through Edinburgh, and that's not what everyone's going to do, but those opportunities were there for you. But I'm thinking not just about preparation that way, but preparation in terms of one's own spiritual life.
Sure.
Can you speak about that? Or?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the natural context of a classroom and an education at a seminary is great, but dig deep wells in your In your church, right? So if you're wanting to exercise gifts and simulate the full range of pastoral duties, invest in youth group, go on pastoral visitation, help out with VBS, volunteer in the nursery, get to know the deacons, minister to shut-ins. I would say dig deep wells where you are in your local congregation. Pastors really grow out of a context of local churches, and pastors pastor, elders elders, deacons deacon. You should be doing those things even if you don't have the title, and that way the church can hopefully affirm those gifts. So dig deep wells in your education, dig deep wells in your church, and then dig deep wells in your own family and your own growth in grace. So holiness has to begin in your own heart, in your own home, and if you neglect those things, you can't pass go and collect $200 and pursue ministry and get ordained. So making sure you're spending time in God's Word, get to know the great books of the Bible, focus on those things that you don't know well, identify areas of weakness, parts of Scripture you need to bone up on, and then focus on reading great classics of personal devotion or biography. Using perhaps weekends or Lord's Day is a great way to do that. Christmas time and summertime, off seasons are great to invest in your own growth and grace. And maybe the best thing for that too is just having godly men in your life who can be mentors and who can help identify areas of weakness and growth. So dig deep wells in your own heart, in your own home, in your own church, and in your own kind of educational pursuits. And out of that, I think, comes a life of hopefully fruitful ministry.
It's striking how often in the New Testament, when the pastoral office is described or the office of elder is described, the focus is on character, is on growth in godliness, is on, we were talking before we started about setting an example for those in the congregation. That seems to be right at the heart of what it means to be a fruitful pastor or fruitful elder.
Yeah, without question. You can think of even Paul saying, follow me as I follow Christ. It's a wonderful thing to have models. I tell my own children, I tell the students at Reformation Bible College, at all points in life, you need to have somebody who is above you or ahead of you maybe, somebody who is beside you, and then somebody who's behind you. So the person who's maybe ahead of you or above you is pouring into you. Person beside you, you're encouraging each other. And then the person who's slightly behind of you, you're investing in and telling them to come on. And it's a constant process of growth. And you see this particularly in Paul's writings and in the pastoral epistles. Just recently thinking through Titus 2, and we all love Titus 2 because you have godly women investing in other younger women. You have godly men investing in younger men. But then Paul actually really centers on Titus, and he says, Titus, you too need to be a model or an example in good works. And one way he models good works is in his teaching ministry. He tells Titus, you need to be a man of integrity and dignity and sound speech. So when you teach, your teaching needs to be your own. You need to be a man of Christ-likeness, dignified, so you are the same man in public as you are in private. And you're a man who watches his words in teaching, not just in formal teaching, but even in the highways and byways, in the morning, in the evening, in the marketplace. You're constantly teaching with sound words. And the reason for that is that no one will speak evil against you and by extension the church. And we can think of how important integrity is for a man. And if we compromise at that level, for those of us in ministry, it doesn't only reflect poorly on us or our families, but also on the church and most importantly on the name of Christ. And so a ministry of integrity is important, and for that reason we need men who are committed to being models of Christ-likeness. Not perfect, but we're showing others our need for Christ, and we are constantly growing in our love for Him. So the importance of being a model, I think, is, for me, an increasingly important reason for why I am interested in theological education and gospel ministry in particular.
And being a model isn't simply a passive exercise. It's not you living your life and other people happen to watch you. That's true, but there seems to be an intentionality behind it where you are actively living as a model, knowing that that's how many men under you are going to learn.
That's right. No, it's not all that dissimilar from being a parent. I think that's why, Paul to Timothy says you begin with how a man manages his home. That's a good indicator of how he'll lead in the church. We don't passively lead our children. There are times when they come to us, and we've got to create an environment where our children love to come to us, but we also have to be intentional and have plans and think through how we're going to educate and pour into our children. I think likewise in ministry, we need to pay attention to how we're spending our time, not just spending time with those who naturally gravitate towards us, but we need to look at how we care for each and every one God has entrusted to us. And so, all of God's people need to be cared for within the church. And as a minister, I think you have an obligation to serve each and every one and think through a plan and a pattern of ministry that accommodates the needs of God's people. And likewise, in a college setting or in a seminary setting, I think we have an obligation to invest in the students that God brings to us. Some we're going to have a natural affinity with, and we need to know that about ourselves. We can also pay attention to those who might be on the margins and who may need more time and attention, and we should think about ways to give that to them.
Two concerns I often hear, or I guess complaints, but that might be too strong a term, but two concerns I hear from young men often who are contemplating the ministry are, first, I don't have a model like that in my life. They're not at RBC. Mm-hmm. So they're struggling with how to even grow in that way because they don't have anyone in their life. And then the second problem is they may have had models that they look to, and sadly those models have fallen and let them down. And that is almost creates a crisis for them. So number one, it's a reminder of how significant this is, significant these models are. But those are things that come up over and over again in the case of young men. You've probably encountered that in your own teaching ministry with guys that you talk to.
Sure. All right, well, let's go with the first question here. It goes back to this idea of just planting roots where you are in your local church, and it may not be an ideal setting, but you'd be surprised on a given Sunday, on a Lord's Day, and you look down one way at your pew, and you look down the other way at your pew, and you've got a range of people. One of the things I tell our students at RBC is, on Sunday, talk to the family that's next to you or in front of you, and just use the formula. Tell me about, and fill in the blank, and then just stop talking and pick anything. Tell me about your week last week. Tell me how you became a member. Tell me about your job. Tell me about your grandchildren. And then just listen. And I think you would be surprised at the gifts that God has given your local congregation. It may come in surprising ways. It may not be the model that you're thinking you want, but God gives gifts to His people, and every church has gifts that need to be enjoyed for their own growth. And so get to know the people in your congregation, elders, Sunday school teachers, deacons, whoever they may be, but get to know as many people as you can in your home congregation. On the second part, it is certainly more difficult. Early on in my marriage to my dear wife, Angela, next month will be 21 years we'll be celebrating our anniversary. Early in our time together, I said, sweetheart, pray that God would protect me from being cynical or protect me from a root of bitterness. So often in ministry, you see much that can cause discouragement, and it's easy to fall prey to cynicism. And yet, quickly, I realized in ministry, the gospel is not necessarily loving what is lovable, but the gospel tells us while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It's loving what is often ugly and painful and hurtful, and we need to be mindful that many in the church have been hurt by the church, and that's precisely why they need good pastors and good congregants and good leaders to come and put their arm around them and love them during times of crisis. But we're not immune. It hurts when we see failure, and whether it's in our own lives or in the lives of those we care a lot about. And we need, as a church, I think, to speak more directly to these issues. But with students at RBC and students at seminaries that have been around, this is a pressing issue, and I think it's important that we need to have these conversations.
And when you talk about having those conversations, you mean guiding them through how they need to think about this, how they need to process it spiritually?
Sure.
Or do you mean going into more detail about the various sins and temptations that befall, or is it all of the above? I mean, what precisely do you mean about taking it on?
I think it can be certainly reactive, yes. If there's a specific case that has faced a church or a community, that's something that needs to be talked through. So if you have a fallen minister, what do you do with their sermons? In the church I served, many in the congregation had been hurt by a minister, and they wanted to know, how to think about sermons that had impacted them by this minister. Or, this minister baptized our children, or, gave us marital counseling. Is that still good?
Yeah.
Well, yes, it's objectively good. And yet it's a reminder of how all of us do need Christ, and we're not immune from temptation. It's amazing to me that Paul in Galatians 6 gives the warning to take heed lest ye fall to those who are mature, who are working in discipline cases. It's actually pastors, it's the mature who are often vulnerable to temptation. And I think we need to help those, particularly in theological training and in ministry preparation, understand the pitfalls of ministry. So I think we do react, and I think we respond to those cases and help people through them. But I think we also proactively encourage, as we talked about just a few moments ago, piety in the home, growth in grace, the need for continuing even education after seminary, the importance of having friends, and we need to help develop positive models of growth in the life of a minister, and that these things don't stop once you're in seminary, but in some ways are even more important when you're beyond it. So on a formative level and on a reactive level, I think we need to do more speaking with students about how to handle crisis in the church.
Sometimes those outside of educational institutions like RBC or Greenville Seminary will often ask, what struggles are you seeing in and among the students? And I know most of your students are not necessarily actively preparing for ordained gospel ministry, but some are. And what in that subset, those men who are thinking in those terms, what kinds of things do you see? What kind of questions are they asking? What kind of issues are clouding their vision or threatening to cloud their vision?
Great. So I think against the backdrop of a contentious political season, I think how tribalized our communities are and churches are have been a real pressing question for many of our students. They're weary of some of that, and they're uncertain. They're also thinking about questions regarding the church and culture. These are perennial issues, and it's something that many of our students face. So I think if you think locally, it's a lot of the division and tribalism that does concern some of our students. And then globally, I think they can often be paralyzed by the profound need of those outside, say, Western contexts. And yet for many of our college students, they have a real burden to see the gospel go where Jesus is not currently named. And I think they carry real concerns there. We have a mix of students. Some are newly converted and have never had the benefit of having a Reformed education or being in a Reformed church. Others have grown up in Reformed churches and homes and love making the most of ministry. But they see the dumpster fire of higher ed. They certainly have concerns about maybe our own country and the economic stability, and then just the contentious aspect of many conversations within the church itself have been a cause of great concern. So if I had to boil it down, I think, maybe locally it's just constant division that they are troubled by. And then globally, I think paralyzed by the need for good biblical teaching in places, not like our own here. So those are at least two things that come up a lot with students at RBC.
So I want to end with this question, because we've been talking and orbiting around issues of the character of a pastor. How attentive do you think the church, and I'm asking a broad brushstroke question, I know that, but how attentive do you think the church is to that as opposed to the kind of credentials that we look for pastoral ministry? So we want certain educational credentials or certain resume boxes checked off. How, in your experience, how attentive is the church to those things, which are clearly at the center in Scripture?
Yeah, probably not very attentive. I think we fall in a mindset that seminaries produce ministers, but churches produce ministers. There are things that seminaries can do that maybe churches can't. We can serve in an ancillary capacity in helping with language acquisition, in some of the scholarly formation. All of those things are wonderful. But churches are the ones who really are most invested in the training and preparation of a minister of the gospel, and also in the ongoing encouragement of ministers. Ministers at times are lonely, perplexed, stretched thin, overwhelmed, discouraged, and may need not only just prayer, but a specific encouraging word. So I would encourage listeners here, whether they have young men in their church who are wanting to be pastors, get to know them, write them letters, take them out to lunch, buy them a book or two, and get to know them and love them and care for them. But also do that for your elders, your deacons, and your pastor as well. Write them a note, babysit for their children, find tangible ways that you can hold up their arms just so that you can let them know that you love them and you want them to have long and fruitful ministries. So I do think churches can be more direct in the support of young ministers in training and also those who are currently serving in ministries. And of course, many do this. But in an age of professionalization, we can develop a mindset where staff do the pastor's job, pastors do the elders' job, the elders do the deacon's job, and the deacons do the congregation's job, and the congregation sits back and enjoys the show. That ought not to be the case. The congregation is to be equipped to serve, and that's why we are in gospel ministry. We're servants through whom others believe. But to reciprocate, congregations need to hold up the arms of ministers who faithfully care for them and love them. So I'd love to see congregations take a vested interest in the formation of men in gospel ministry.
John, thanks for taking some time today.
Oh, thanks for having me.